and welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark, speaking with our good friend Father Charles P. Connor from our Washington studios. Toil and Transcendence is the book, Catholicism in the 20th Century America, published by EWTN, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Great to see you, Father Connor. You're on with Father Mitch, and another book rolling out from you, proudly published by us here at EWTN.
Absolutely. Well, as always, I'm honored to be with you, Doug, and the affiliation's been a long one.
Right.
I'm getting old now, but I mean, I remember my young days.
Right, yeah. So 24 years ago, I think, is when you were first around on with Mother Angelica, and then we did that redo of the series you had done, right, on the history of the Church in the United States, and hence we've done other programs since then, right?
Oh, many other series over the years, yes. So
now
it's been a great ride. I'm an old man now looking back on it all, you know. But
well, you're not old. You're a sage. You're a sage, Father. Just remember that. So.
Oh, aren't you kind? Boy, oh boy.
And one of the great things really impressed me from all your work over the years was we did that series, and then we came up with the Church in Time, which were these little historical spots about the Church. And what the amazing thing was, and I'll tell everybody, we would stand there with the camera. Father would look at a little card, a little index card for about 10 seconds, put it down, and then do the whole spot perfectly. One take Connor. One take Connor.
Yeah, there you go. Look at that. They were the days, Doug, I'll tell you.
I tell you, it helps if historians, I guess, have good memories. So that's part of the deal, right?
It's a bit of a hell, oh, sure.
Right. Well, let's talk about this. You consider this part of a trilogy, right? Is that because of Catholic beginnings, New York and Maryland, and now this book, or what are the books you consider the trilogy?
Yeah, the books, all of which, of course, have been published by EWTN Publishing. And we began with Pioneer Priests and Makeshift Altars, which talked about the colonial period and the revolutionary period and a bit on the early national period. Then the second volume, Faith and Fury, took in the period of the coming of the Civil War, the war years themselves, and Reconstruction. And now in this final book, we take up the story in the years after Reconstruction, most particularly in the 1880s. And I finish it very much on purpose in 1984. The last thing we talk about is the opening, of formal diplomatic relations with the Vatican during Ronald Reagan's administration. I thought it good to end the book on a rather high note because as you start getting closer and closer to our contemporary times, it gets harder, I think, quite a bit harder, to be very, very objective. The verdict of history is not in, necessarily, and the verdict of history, as we know so well, is a subjective verdict. You can agree with it, disagree with it, take it or leave it. But, I mean, historians, the closer we get to our own times, have really not had sufficient time to weigh in.
Right now,
so I thought, well,
and
let's end it in 1984.
Right. So in interesting year, 1984. I think we're living 1984. Some people would think, Father. So in the forward, we've got Archbishop Hebda wrote. He said, "The historian is a veritable midwife to our faith," and he was talking about you. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think he was talking about how the faith cannot help but come alive the more we study it, the more we look at the lives of those who have preceded us, we look at the contributions that they have made, and most particularly, we look at the faith that they had. And, you know, we build on all of these things in our own time. So whenever you try to make a contribution by hearkening back to those wonderful people and what they did, regardless of how long ago it may have been. I think our own faith is really nurtured and strengthened in the whole experience.
Now, he also mentions here that you capture masterfully the personalities and contributions of the leaders who shaped American church throughout this period, this last 100 years going up to 1984. Who was your favorite character in this story?
the list, that list would be too long to count, I'm afraid. But there are a number. You know, I've always had great interest in and admiration for James Cardinal Gibbons, who was an Archbishop of Baltimore until his death in 1921. He was Archbishop for just about 40 years. And Gibbons really came to epitomize the Catholic Church in the United States in his era, the 1880s and 90s and the first 20 years of the 20th century. When people thought about the Catholic Church in America, they thought about Cardinal Gibbons. You know, he was the great champion of the labor movement. The Knights of Labor got them recognized by the Church. Had a lot to do with the writing of Leo XIII's writing of Rerum Novarum. And he was a very close friend of both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. T.R. Roosevelt referred to the cardinal as the chivus primus, the first citizen of the United States. And so his career was a phenomenal one in so many ways. As I say, he was a good friend of those two presidents, not so much of Woodrow Wilson. There was a lot of anti-Catholicism in the Wilson period and during his administration. So I would say that the relationship was very cool between Archbishop's house in Baltimore and the White House, you know. But so he would certainly be one of the very strong figures, I think, emerging in this book. Another one at the other end of the spectrum would be President Reagan himself and his very close collaboration and work with Pope John Paul II. And we spent a lot of time discussing that at the end of the book. And there's been great literature that's been written by some authors in the last 10 to 15 years, I guess, tracing and underscoring that development, the friendship that developed between these two men, and also the blossoming of that friendship through many of their subordinates, how the government worked with the Reagan administration, worked with the Vatican, and so on and so forth, to bring down communism and also to bring down, or rather to establish formal relations. So certainly that would be another chapter, I think, of a lot of interest. And but again, to answer that, I'd say it'd be a long list.
Well, it'll be
They're
great
all
for people.
interesting
They go
way.
through the book, and there's a lot of different people, including Bishop Sheen and others who come about. I thought it was interesting because you talked about in the beginning of the book, as part of the prelude, dealing with the late 19th century. You talk about how things kind of kick off with the whole issue of infallibility. And you talk about the idea of the American bishops were divided into opportunists and inopportunists. And who were they?
That's right. The opportunists were those, obviously, who thought that it was the time was very ripe to define the doctrine of papal infallibility. The inopportunists, no, it would be a bad move for the Church. As far as the American bishops who would fall into the inopportunist camp, and I think certainly their leader would have been Peter Richard Kenrick of St. Louis, but one of the main reasons they had here, Doug, and I think a very understandable reason on their part, is if this kind of a teaching were promulgated, if this kind of a doctrine were solemnly promulgated by the Church, then what was going to happen in the United States? Nativism was going to raise its head again, you know. Arthur Schlesinger Sr. made a comment to Monsignor John Tracy Ellis at a historical meeting. He said, I really believe anti-Catholicism is the bias against your church is the deepest seated bias in the American people. So there were many people that said, no, this is not the right time to define papal infallibility. And many of the bishops at the First Vatican Council left the council early because they did not want to cast a negative vote in the presence of the Holy Father, who would have been Pius IX. Thanks be to God, that doctrine was indeed solemnly promulgated. But Kenrick was an interesting story in this regard because he could find no theological justification or scriptural justification to define the doctrine of papal infallibility. But what's very significant, and I should mention, too, he was the brother, rather, of Francis Patrick Kenrick, who was Archbishop of Baltimore. They were both Dublin-born men who rose quite high in this country in the hierarchy. But Kenrick got up in his cathedral in St. Louis very shortly after the promulgation of the doctrine, and you could not find a more resounding affirmation of his support, purely and simply on the basis of the Church solemnly
making that
defining.
decision and going
And I think that's a
forward.
tremendous credit to Archbishop Kenrick, you know, and to the loyalty to the church these men had. When the church has spoken, the church has spoken.
Now, it's interesting, too, because in that section, you talk about the idea of the social gospel and that movement married with American liberalism, religious liberalism. We hear about the social gospel all the time now. I thought it was interesting because you have a quote here from a particular minister, Charles M. Sheldon, I believe, a congregational minister, who defined it as to abolish the devil and hell and deny original sin. Is that what's going on with some of the people who are pushing the social gospel's outer limits?
Well, I think Sheldon's reaction was probably a bit extreme, and that's one of the reasons I use that quote in the book. That, of course, Doug, is set against the background of the progressive era of United States history, and that's roughly the first 20 years, first 2 decades of the 20th century. And you have progressive reform on the national level, the state level, the local level, cities, states, and the federal government. You have democratic reform, Republican reform. You have the administrations of T.R., Taft, and Wilson all contributing. You have the work of the muckrakers, you know, and the famous books by Lincoln Steffens, The Shame of the Cities, and Lillian Wall's House on Henry Street in New York City, and the work of Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago, and so forth. So it's set against that kind of a background, and the accusation is obviously made that it was a totally secular thing. I don't necessarily know that it was, and the reason that I don't think it was is because there was a Catholic reaction, if you will, ultimately, a Catholic form of progressivism. One of the finest examples of that would be the opening of the School of Social Work at the Catholic University of America in Washington under later Monsignor William Kirby, and the Catholic summer schools, you know, up at Lake Champlain in New York. So there was a Catholic progressivism to get people better educated on the problems of the day and so forth. The fact that there was such a strong Catholic contribution, I think, indicates a certain validity there to the whole point.
Right, but there's some underlying tensions in there as well, and we need to be aware of that, especially, I think, today. You also
positively.
say what began after 1900 was a shift from the laissez-faire ideology to a greater stress on the general welfare, from social Darwinism to state intervention. This perfectibility of man came to be seen as coming from individuals, not from individuals, but from the collective action. Again, is that not something we're seeing today as well?
Oh, indeed it is. Indeed it is. It probably is summed up in the phrase, man is the measure of all things, you know, and it's, and the whole idea of what we see today, of what we see, of what we saw in those days through the progressive era and the rise of the social gospel in the United States and so forth, much of that is because it is so based on man's ingenuity. It goes all the way back to the Calvinistic ethic that was brought here in colonial days, and it really, I think it was epitomized by a Canadian writer of some years ago by the name of George Grant. George Grant summarized it beautifully in one sentence. He said, "Contemplation never crossed the ocean." And what he meant by that was we have to get rid of the old society, the Catholicism that so dominated Western Europe, and we're breaking away from that. American Protestantism, it's coming into its own. And that feeling, as I say, goes all the way back, and that's a contributory factor to the anti-Catholicism as well, no question about it. But yes, it's very traceable today, as you indicate. It's always seems to be part of the ongoing American psyche.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I know when you were on with Father Mitch, you talked obviously about Al Smith and that whole anti-Catholicism. I thought this was interesting. You talk about one of the great attacks against them came from the New York's Methodist Christian Advocate newspaper when it was pointed out that it wanted to remind readers that a Roman Catholic assassinated Lincoln, assassinated Garfield, and assassinated McKinley.
Well, again, you'd have to wonder about the quality of the Roman Catholics doing the assassinating there. I am not honestly sure about either Garfield or McKinley. But John Wilkes Booth most certainly was not a Catholic. He was an Episcopalian, to give you his religious creed. So that statement is wrong as far as Booth is concerned, and certainly would be wrong. I don't know if these assassins may, just judging from their surnames, they may have been baptized Catholics at one time. But I have never read anything to indicate that anyone who, either of these fellows who committed such horrible crimes were ever, practicing Catholics, so to speak.
Right, I think Mary Surratt and her family were, and there was, they were part of the cabal.
Oh,
so
they were absolutely,
they were.
And as was Dr. Mudd, down in Southern Maryland, who repaired John Wilkes Booth's injuries.
Right.
Dr. Mudd, a very devout Catholic. Mary Surratt, a very devout Catholic.
Right, and John Surratt as well. Her son who was involved.
And
now
her son John.
Right. Let's jump ahead, Louis Payne, as well. Church of the 50s. You talk about the heyday, the Indian summer. What happened in the 1950s that brought about this burst of, in a sense, this Catholic heyday, this idyllic period?
Well, it was the immediate post-World War II era, of course, and if we understand the post-World War II era, the intense degree of patriotism that accompanied American involvement in the Second World War, as soon as the war ended, you come into a period internally in the church in the United States where the faith is enormously strong. Percentages vary, but you would have to say 75 to 80% at least of the Roman Catholic population in the United States went to Mass every Sunday and every holy day of obligation. The parochial school system in America was bursting at the seams and literally was the envy of the Catholic world. People took their faith seriously. I mean, a way to sum this up is if you were a Catholic in the 50s, you were a Catholic.
Right.
That was going to change, of course. But when we say what brought it about in the 50s, it had already been there for a lot of decades, but it was built upon very significantly in the 1950s. And then, but you see, you had that peace and prosperity, naturally, that followed World War II. You have the passage of the GI Bill, Doug, which was a very, very important piece of legislation in United States Catholic history, because thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Catholic veterans got a college education, which had been unheard of before. And you had the flight to the suburbs, you had the beginning of affluence, and then, of course, you had the opening of the whole revolutionary era of the 1960s. On the one hand, the GI Bill did enormous good. But if you trace the thing down a number of years, the further we get, into the story, there are detrimental aspects. Obviously, we're all very much aware of them as history, as society has unfolded in the last
and as
few
people,
decades.
as people who lived through the '60s, it's interesting too because you got this high point. You've got this American president who's a Catholic, quote unquote. Gets named 1960. Things are happening. And then you've got, let's say, 63, the assassination. And from there on, you see, obviously, problems in the culture that have a major impact on the church, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you have the whole sexual revolution, which had a world of its own, obviously. But the upheavals of the 1960s, the war protests of the 1960s, people taking a whole different view of life and a whole different view of society, the faith weakening, and then I think it's very correct to say that the Second Vatican Council got into the wrong theological hands. Many bishops of those days tended to hand the workings over to the quote-unquote experts. Yet the so-called experts were very, very controversial people and took the church down a tumultuous road until you had the advent of such things in the 1980s, I guess it was, of the Eternal Word television network. When you stop to think about it, EWTN was a very, very strong response, and it filled in a tremendous vacuum to the faith that people were yearning for, looking for, missing, if you will. yeah, everything was so totally revolutionary
Right.
that to go back now and look at the 1950s or what went before it is a trip down memory lane, and it's nostalgia, but it's also it bolsters your faith in many instances to look back at those years. But you had the men like de Lubac and Hans Urs von Balthasar, Karol Wojtyła, and certainly Joseph Ratzinger. They were the beginnings of the whole communio school of theology, which was also a very significant response to so much of the controversial theology that was immediately following Vatican II and continued to prosper for many, many years thereafter.
And one of the things you talk about, obviously, you got Humanae Vitae, the pushback from the theologians, the universities, Land O'Lakes, all these kinds of things happening. And you mentioned the fact that many of today's controversies can be traced to events such as these. During this era, the Church in America increasingly adopted a posture of accommodation to dissent in the secular world, which in many respects continues into the 20th century. Explain.
It does indeed. The dissent of 1968 was, in one way, a long ways in the making. Probably it started with the formation of the Papal Commission by John the 23rd and the expansion of that commission by St. Paul VI, studying this whole question of contraception. Well, why in heaven's name, people wondered, is the Church studying it? Are they indeed going to relax some of their previous rigor and open themselves to the modern world? Well, Paul VI very clearly claimed they were not going to do that, and just for the writing of Humanae Vitae, if nothing else, Paul VI is a deserved saint in heaven today. So, but then you have the whole story of the radical theologians at Catholic University in the summer of 1968. They made the hierarchy of the Catholic Church look like gentlemen who absolutely did not know what they were talking about. We're the theologians. We're the experts. We know contemporary men and women. We know how to interpret the Church, etc., etc., etc. And because in so many instances you could say that the members of the hierarchy did not necessarily have the same theological credentials, they were taken not only less seriously, they were not taken seriously at all. And in a very particular way, a number of bishops who were serving on the board of trustees of the university in those days had a terrible, terrible time dealing with these theologians. But this whole policy of accommodation continues, right to the present day. There's no question about that. Started then. I think it had a very powerful manifestation in 1968, and through the 70s, the dissent just went on and on, and we're still living with it. Absolutely, no question about that.
Let me ask you, because you mentioned about the experts. It seems like that's a kind of something that's across the secular world as well. Everybody's always turning to the experts to get, what to do and not to do. And it seems like there's almost a tyranny of that in some ways these days.
I think there is, and it's always at the expense of turning to the teaching church. And most particularly when we think of the teaching church, we think of that magnificent catechism of the Catholic Church, wherein our faith is so beautifully explained and brought forward to modern men and women. But it seems as though there are always the gurus of the age, and it happened. One example, it happened beginning in the 1970s in the field of biblical studies, the development of the historical critical method and so forth. It's interesting to see generations of priests, for example, who jumped on the bandwagon of the exegetical gurus of those days. That's just to use one example. Church leaders who took quote-unquote popular positions through the 70s and 80s were oftentimes listened to more so than John Paul II or Benedict the 16th would have been. And there's something, I guess it's rebellious in the nature of the human being or something, But we always seem to think that the experts are those who really and truly know, when many experts have led many people astray. Right. And there again, that's a continuously evolving theme, I think, and certainly in the history of the Church in the United States.
Well, let me ask you, with this Toil and Transcendence, 20th Catholicism of 20th Century America, this book, what's next for you?
Oh boy, the retirement probably. I don't know. No, there are always ideas going on in my head, Doug. You know, but I like to take a little period of time in between the ideas so I can try to formulate them a little bit better.
So, how long did it take you actually to put this book together once you decided to do it?
Usually, those books, I think, were all put together. Each one of them was put together in one academic year. So, in other words, I would start at the beginning of the school term, you know, in the late August or early September, and I'd have them concluded by May or June, as a rule. You know, you have to kind of work them in between everything else that goes on in the course of a day.
That's right.
But it's been very, very interesting project.
If all of us had your intellect and your energy. Thank you so much, Father Charles P. Connor, author of Toil and Transcendence, Catholicism in 20th Century America, proudly published by EWTN Publishing. Available through our EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, for all things Catholic. This has been EWTN's Bookmark. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Father Connor.